break actually to do some research at the new History Center because I was doing a paper on the history of logging in Kanabec County. But that's not what I'm here to talk about today. We're going to talk about the founder of Mora instead. And I think many in the room probably know that Mora was founded in 1882. And the name of the founder was Myron Kent. Now back in those days, if you wanted to found a town, what you needed to do is you had to get some information about where the railroads were going to build their next line. And Myron Kent worked as a bookkeeper at a logging store just south of Hinckley in Mission Creek. And somehow, as I talk and we get a little more familiar with his personality, I think we'll get an idea why, because he was a gregarious, friendly person. He got some information that a railroad line was going to be built between Hinckley and St. Cloud. So he came to the land that's just south of what we call Lake Mora and bought a lot of that property. And he platted the property, and when the railroad came through, he became the founder of Mora. And he got involved in the town right away. He became a postmaster. He became a county attorney. It was only a little more than a dozen years later that he was at the middle of what the Minneapolis Journal said was a legal and political battle without parallel in the criminal annals of the Northwest. There were stories about him in all the papers in the country, including the New York Times. And the newspapers in the Midwest carried stories about Myron Kent regularly for 3 years. But I'm getting a little ahead of the story. I've got to tell you how we got there. When Myron Kent came to east central Minnesota, he was 36 years old. He represented himself to be younger than that, but that was his actual age. And he must have had a bit of an English accent. And he told people his parents remained in England and were quite wealthy. And he had a real flair for the dramatic. Now, the store that he worked with was part of the Laird lumber operations. And the Lairds were just at a point where they were making an awful lot of money in timber, and they were relocating down to Minneapolis. And although the Lairds hired Kent, the two brothers who were starting to run the operation, Frank and Bruce, must have seen something in Kent they didn't like, because Myron became interested in their younger sister, Julia, who was 19 at the time, and wanted to marry her. And whether it was because of the age difference or because of something about Kent they didn't like, they strongly objected to the marriage. But Myron went ahead, and he and Julia got married. And as I said, Myron had a flair for the dramatic. And so they ended up getting married at the stroke of midnight, 1882. And they lived in Mora, on Lake Mora, and after a year, they had a son, and they named him Earl. So Myron became involved in the small community of Mora in those early years, and he became good friends with some of the people whose names that we see still in the paper now and then. One of his friends was named Stan Seavey. Seavey was the son of a river pilot from the early days of Kanabec County, down in the lower Snake River. And Stan Seavey's sister was married to Charles Williams, and he's maybe the early pioneer of Mora that we hear most often. He had a long life, lived all the way to 1951, and most of us know his house that he built is sitting on Maple, just a block off of Union Street, a very elegant house, still there today. Charles Williams, or as they called themselves in the late 19th century by initials, C.E. Williams. And another of Kent's friends was an attorney in town, Pope, J.C. Pope, another name that we see often when we look back through the records of Mora. So the Kents were in Mora a few years, and the Laird family must have warmed to him a little bit because they called him to Minneapolis and they put him in charge of one of their companies. And it was the Fall River Manufacturing Company, and immediately Kent lost $20,000 and the company failed. and it's not clear exactly what happened. We know that the Lairds wanted to buy a gold mine in California. They bought the mine. They went out to find out after they paid the money that all the gold had been mined out of the mine. So it was either a very bad investment or, as the Laird suspected, a swindle by Kent. They suspected that he knew the seller and had himself then received some of the money. So there was a big falling out. Regardless of what caused this, Kent was broke. He was disgraced. The Lairds fired him, and he left his wife and his young son and tried to go out and redeem himself. And he traveled across the country. He went out to the West Coast. He went out to the East Coast. He had some hard times. He wrote back at one point to one of the Laird brothers, Frank Laird, and said he was so depressed he was considering shooting himself. And Frank Laird wrote back and said, "Go ahead. And if you don't own a gun to do it, I'd be delighted to send you one." So Kent ended up in North Dakota, in Mandan, North Dakota, and he really landed on his feet. And he was a jack of all trades. He did some legal work out there. He was an insurance agent. He was a surveyor. He worked with livestock and established himself enough that he persuaded his wife, Julia, and their son to come out and live with him. And the Laird brothers were really opposed to her being united with Kent. And in fact, Frank Laird said, "I'd rather see you go to the cemetery than go out to Mandan to live with that man again." But she went out there, and they lived in Mandan. Now we're about 12 years after Mora was founded. And one of his friends in Mora, I mentioned, was Stan Seavey. And Seavey worked up in Superior. And if you look at newspapers from that era, Superior was really the commercial center that Mora looked toward, almost more than the Twin Cities. And there was a lot of businessmen in Mora who would take the train up to Superior. And Duluth Superior was a booming community in the late 1800s. So Seavey's up in Superior. It's 1894. And who should appear unannounced at his door but Myron Kent? And Seavey described him as hard up, despondent, and discouraged. And he asked for a $600 loan. And he said he needed that money to go to England to get a $30,000 loan from his mother. Well, of course, Seavey didn't have $600. So he gave Kent $20, and he gave him some encouraging words, and Kent left. He got on the train and went to Chicago. And Seavey came right back down to Mora. He was going back and forth. And he got to Mora, and the very next day he looked at the Kanabec County Times, and he saw an article that had the following words: "Mrs. M.R. Kent," that would be Julia, "formerly of Mora, was instantly killed at Mandan, North Dakota, Wednesday morning. It is claimed that burglars were trying to get into the farmhouse, and the hired man discovered their presence, got a shotgun, and fired. Instead of shooting the burglars, he shot Mrs. Kent. He was arrested and an inquest held. The old settlers of Kanabec County will receive the tidings with sorrow." Now that farmhand was named Tom Swedinsky. He was about 30 years old. He came from what they called at the time Bohemia, so this is what is today the Czech Republic. He came over to the States when he was a teenager, and he worked in the West, all the way from Texas to Colorado to the Dakotas. He was a farmhand, worked with horses as well. And he'd been a farmhand at the Kent house for about 6 months. Now on the day that Julia died, he went into town, Swedinsky did, and came back, and it was evident right away that he'd been drinking heavily. So much so that when they went to bed that night, Julia asked her son Earl, who by this time was 10 years old, to come and sleep in her room. And they all went to bed, and after a couple hours, Swedinsky woke them up and said, "There are burglars who are peering in the windows of the house." And for an extended period of time, about 2 hours or so, the 3 people in the house, Julia and little Earl and the farmhand Tom Swedinsky, would go from window to window peering out. And Swedinsky had a shotgun, and finally the shotgun went off, right before Earl's eyes, and as was described later, blew away half of Julia's head. The barrel was so close that they could see the black powder on her face, the gunpowder. So the hired hand and Earl rushed out of the farmhouse to go to the neighbor's house. It's about midnight now, and as they're going, little Earl points to the haystack and warns Tom and says, "There's one of the men." And they run to the neighbor's house. Well, quickly, of course, the sheriff is called, and the sheriff, his name was George Bingenheimer. And the sheriff came and he took custody of Swedinsky, and he took custody of a notebook that Swedinsky had on his person. And he quickly called together a coroner's jury. And the jury listened to the evidence, and Swedinsky and Earl testified about these men staring in at the window. And they described their size. One of them was large, another was smaller. They described their facial features. One of them had a mustache, and one of them had a hat. These are the descriptions that they gave. And the coroner's jury said that the death of Julia Kent was accidental. Now, when the sheriff Swedinsky went into the house, he was accompanied by a man named Tuttle, R.M. Tuttle, who was the editor of the newspaper in Mandan, the Mandan Pioneer. And back in those days in Mandan, like a lot of small towns, everybody had multiple jobs. And Tuttle not only was the editor of the newspaper, but he was also the stenographer, the court reporter for the local court. And his newspaper was owned by the sheriff, Bingenheimer, who asked him to be on the coroner's jury. So Swedinsky was acquitted because the death had been ruled an accident, but the sheriff thought it was best to keep him in jail until Myron Kent returned to town. Myron had left a few days earlier on business. And a week went by, and Kent still had not returned to town. And you can imagine what people were thinking in Mandan. And in fact, Tuttle then put an editorial in the newspaper to talk about the situation, and he pointed out something that seemed to be a theme that ran all through Myron Kent's life. He said, half the people in town think that Myron Kent is one of the most intelligent, kindest men they've ever met. But the other half, and Tuttle made clear he was in the other half, this is what Tuttle said: there was something about the man that seemed to render him able to hypnotize people. He had a glib tongue. He was experienced in getting out of tight holes, and he did this to perfection. It is a question if this state ever was visited by a bigger scoundrel, a man who spent his time so successfully and assiduously in robbing the poor. Well, as soon as Julia died, her brothers, the Lairds, immediately came up from Minneapolis to take the body back and to take Earl back with them. Initially, Earl didn't want to go. He ran through the alleys, they caught up with them, and he took them back to Minneapolis. The Lairds now had a lot of money through their logging operations, and they had a lot of political influence in Minneapolis. And they went down to the mayor's office, Mayor Eustace. You might be familiar with Eustace Street in the Twin Cities. And they demanded that the mayor give them the services of the best detective on the Minneapolis police force. And the mayor did that. And his name was John Hoy. They suspected right away something was funny here. Well, a month goes by. Myron Kent still cannot be found. And Seavey is back in Mora, and he receives a letter from Myron Kent. And Myron is writing from Trenton, Nebraska. Now, this is a small town down in southwestern Nebraska, and he's writing using an alias. He's calling himself W.H. Strong. And he writes Seavey and says, I am just out of money. And he asks for some money. And he says, let no living soul know where I am. I know I can trust my life in your hands. His letter didn't make any mention at all of Julia. And Seavey got the letter, and he immediately wires back and says, do you know your wife has been murdered? And Kent replies, no, comply with the request of my letter. So now the sheriff in Mandan, a month has gone by, and he circulates 10,000 wanted posters around the United States. And one of them finds its way to Trenton, Nebraska, and the local sheriff sees this new person in town fits the description from the poster. And so he arrests Kent. But Kent persuades him, it's not necessary to arrest me. You don't have to put me in handcuffs. And a woman from Trenton at the time wrote this later about it. He was dressed so nicely and was so gentlemanly all the time that people could not believe him guilty of any crime. So Kent was, in essence, under house arrest. He stayed with the deputy sheriff, and they were having dinner on Saturday night. And Kent said, I'm going to go into the kitchen and get myself a drink of water. And he went into the kitchen, and he walked out the back door, and he walked down to the river, and he followed it right out of Trenton. When this news got back to Mandan, the sheriff brought the coroner's jury back together, and they revised their verdict. They said they could not determine whether Julia's death had been an accident or not. Swedinsky still remains in jail, but Swedinsky is writing some letters, and he's writing them in Bohemian, and the sheriff, Bingenheimer, intercepts the letters, and he gives them to the Lairds. And the Lairds take them back down to Minneapolis. And they go to the mayor's office, and the mayor says, well, I'm going to introduce you to a man named Walter Ehrlichman. Now, I'm giving you a lot of names here, but Ehrlichman, other than Kent, to me is the most interesting person in this whole story. Ehrlichman is an interpreter for the Minneapolis court system. He speaks 8 languages. He's from Eastern Europe. He looks at the letters, and he translates them. And he says in one of the letters, the farmhand Swedinsky is writing to his brother in Iowa, and he says, oh, how I wish you were here at least a short time, that I could unload a great weight that lays upon my heart. And when the Lairds learn this, they ask the mayor to make Ehrlichman part of the investigative team. And Ehrlichman says, I'm not an investigator, I'm not a detective, I'm a court reporter and an interpreter. And the Lairds don't let up, and the mayor commands Ehrlichman to work with Hoy to investigate Myron Kent. So a few months go by, and Hoy and Ehrlichman, the detectives, investigate Kent, and what they find out goes far beyond anything that even the Laird brothers had ever suspected. Turns out that Kent was not from England, he was from Ohio. And he was not even Myron Kent. His birth name had been William Wiley Pancoast. He'd been a very intelligent man. His profession was banking, and he rose to prominence in eastern Ohio. The local newspaper called him the local young Napoleon of finance. He married a woman from Ohio, Emma Terrell. After a few years of marriage, Emma died, and the following year, Pancoast embezzled $14,000 from his bank, the First National Bank of Medina. Now, this was in 1873, 1874, and the United States was going through a very severe depression in 1873. There were many banks that failed, and this may have been one of the reasons that bank got into trouble, but there's really no doubt that $14,000 was embezzled. Pancoast later admitted that, and the bank collapsed, and he skipped town. And the people in Medina, Ohio started talking and said, you know, when his wife died last year, I'll bet he poisoned her. Why would a young woman die like that? Pancoast was on the run for 7 years. He went up to Toronto, and then he went across to England. He went to France. He went to Belgium. Now, this is in the 1870s. He came back to the States. He went down to Texas. He went to Galveston. Then he went back up to Canada, went to Toronto, and he crossed the Atlantic again and went to England. Then he went up to Scotland. Then he came back to the States. He went to Chicago. He went to San Francisco. And eventually he went to Australia. And everywhere he went, he used a different name. When he was in North America, his name was Judd C. Lane. When he was in Europe, sometimes he called himself Angel Herrick, sometimes James Watson. When he was in Australia, he called himself J.F. Lane. It wasn't until he arrived in Minnesota, the year before he founded Mora, that he adopted the name Myron Rudolph Kent. This is what the detectives discovered. Now the summer went by and the manhunt continued for Kent. So Ehrlichman, the stenographer, the translator from Minneapolis, decides that he's going to really act the role of detective. So he himself puts on a disguise and he calls himself Dublinsky. And he says he's a lawyer, and he goes down to Iowa to visit the farmhand's brother. And he goes in, and he can speak the same language, and he convinces the farmhand that he's the lawyer for his brother. And he said, I could help him more if he would just tell me everything. Can you please write a letter instructing him to tell me everything? And the brother does this. Now the Mandan newspaper talks about Ehrlichman, and this is how he's described. This is the stenographer. This is the translator. He has dark features and black piercing eyes. A heavy dark mustache hides a row of pearly teeth. So he comes back with this letter, and he and the sheriff Bingenheimer and the newspaper editor Tuttle and the local prosecuting attorney in Mandan, whose name was Voss, they set up a mock trial. And they bring Swedinsky in and convince him that this is the trial. And they tell him Myron Kent has been apprehended and there's nothing for you to do but tell the truth about what happened here. And Swedinsky gives them a confession. He says that in the month before Julia's death, Myron had come up to him and said, I want you to kill my wife. And if you do it right, it's going to look like an accident. And I'll leave, and you can do it, and the only person here will be Earl, and he's young and impressionable, and if you do it well, make it look like an accident, he'll believe it was an accident. And I'm going to be gone because I'm going to go to England, and I'm going to collect $30,000 in a loan from my mother. And I'm going to come back, and I'll meet you down in the Cherokee country, Oklahoma, and I'll give you $18,000. And right away, Swedinsky is horrified by this. I don't want anything to do with this. But Kent is persistent, he says, and keeps telling him, you can do this, you can do this. $18,000. And Kent says, I'm going to describe to you exactly how you can do this. And I want you to write it down, everything I tell you. And Kent narrates how this is going to happen. You're going to be in the house. You're going to say that burglars are looking in your windows. You're going to get the gun. You're going to accidentally shoot her in the head. And it was very detailed, and Swedinsky wrote the whole thing down in Bohemian in this notebook. And Kent said to him, every spare moment you have the next month, when you're sitting out in the barn in the hayloft, you read this back and forth until you've got every word committed to memory. Because when she's dead and the sheriff comes in, you're not going to have time to think. You're going to have to know the story. And most important of all, destroy the notebook. And the last thing, destroy the notebook, was something that Swedinsky didn't do. And this was the notebook that the sheriff took from him when he was arrested the night of the murder. Why in the world would Kent want his wife to be killed? Well, Swedinsky said that Kent told him, my wife is suspicious about something, and I cannot let it go much longer. Now, this mock trial later was claimed to be, Swedinsky later claimed that he'd been tortured, and this is the reason he had confessed. And this was, back in the late 19th century, this was actually believed by the public to be true. I'm convinced that it wasn't true, that there was maybe psychological torture, but not physical torture. But about 7 or 8 years after all of this, President McKinley was assassinated. He was assassinated by an anarchist. And there was a great fear in the country at the time that there might be a ring of assassins who were going to kill all the federal government officials. And the St. Paul newspaper at the time said, what we need to do with this assassin is give him the same treatment that was given to Tom Swedinsky 7 years ago back in North Dakota, to get the words out from him. So it was generally assumed that this had happened. And I'm going to divert just a little bit from my story here because I just find this so interesting. For those of you who are baseball fans, Twins fans, you might have seen that in spring training they had a pitcher whose name was Tyler Kinley. And he was with the team for a month or so, and then he was released. But he was a descendant of President McKinley. And I remember reading a newspaper article this spring, and they said, why is your name Kinley if your great-grandfather was William McKinley? And he said at the time that the president was assassinated, there was such a fear in the family that more assassins were coming after the family that they changed their name from McKinley to Kinley. And then one of the descendants is now a professional pitcher. Okay, well, we're going to go back to Myron Kent now. So, while they really hadn't apprehended Kent, they had told Swedinsky they had, but they hadn't. And so Ehrlichman comes up with another idea. He's still going to use the name Dublinsky, and he's still going to represent himself to be an attorney. And in fact, he makes up some letterhead for his law firm, and he makes up some business cards. And he gets a silk tie and a cane, and he gets on the train, and he comes to Mora. And the reason he comes to Mora is because in one of the farmhand's letters, there's a mention that Mr. Kent sometimes corresponded with a friend of his in Mora named J.C. Pope. This is the attorney in Mora I'd mentioned earlier. So he gets off the train. You can imagine in 1894, he was probably quite a sight in Mora, and he totters into Pope's law office. And right away he identifies himself as a lawyer for Swedinsky, and he wants to help Kent as much as he can. And he thought that, is there any information Pope has that maybe could help with that? And Pope right away says, you know, I know where Kent is. He's been sending me letters. And Dublinsky, Ehrlichman, says, okay, then maybe you can help me. I thank you very much. And he leaves. And a day later, Seavey from Superior comes back to town and says to his friend Pope, you know, of course, there's nothing they can talk about, but Kent. And Seavey asked Pope, have you heard anything from Kent? And he says, yes. He's been writing me letters. He said, let's go to my office. It's a Sunday, and I'll show you the letters. And they go to his office, and they go in. And this is how the Kanabec County Times reports what happened. Mr. Pope opened his desk, and lo, and behold, the letter, nor any of Kent's letters could be found. And it dawned upon Mr. Pope then that he had fallen into a trap, and had been made a tool of the detective, which displeased him greatly. So, I mean, Pope doesn't come off real well here. He's been totally fooled by Ehrlichman, and Ehrlichman has come back at night, broken into the office, and stolen the letters. So where has Kent been this whole time? He left Trenton, Nebraska, and he started wandering south. And he wandered about 200 miles, almost all of it by foot. Now this isn't, he's in eastern Colorado, so this is not the Colorado of the mountains, of the Rocky Mountains. This is flat, arid, hot country, and it's the summertime. Kent thinks he's dying. He claims that at one point he went 3 days without food or water. After 200 miles, he straggles into this big ranch called Arroyo. It's a little town still in Colorado, and he starts working at the ranch. And it's from Arroyo that he writes a letter to Pope, and that's the letter that's stolen by Ehrlichman. And so Pope immediately wires down to Arroyo and says the detectives know where you are. And Kent leaves Arroyo immediately and keeps going south. Now Ehrlichman, who has the letters, looks at a map and says if Kent was in Arroyo, and he's probably heading down to the New Mexico territory. And if he's going to do that, he's going to cross through a little town in eastern Colorado called Arlington. So Ehrlichman gets on the trains and he goes to Arlington. And he gets there and he goes to the city fathers, and he says, I am an agent for a colony of Mennonites, and we're thinking of settling in this area. And I've been charged with learning everything I can about Arlington, everyone who's here, what they do. I need to learn everything I can. And they say, that's great. They're thrilled. They want the Mennonites to come in. They want to be a growing community. And they tell him everything. And one of the things he learns is that a new person has just straggled into town. And so this stenographer, this interpreter from Minneapolis, arrests Myron Kent in Arlington, Colorado. It's September 2 of 1894, and just by a wild coincidence, September 2 is the day after the Great Hinckley Fire. So that's what people in Mora are thinking about, the Great Fire. It was the day after that, though, that Kent was arrested. He was going by the name I.O. Hope. He had $3.17 in his pockets. He was collecting bones when Ehrlichman found him. Ehrlichman hustles him onto the train. They're going to go back to Mandan, but before they go there, they go through Minneapolis. And the detective, the other detective, John Hoy, is at the train station. And as the train approaches and he sees Kent, he calls out to him, "How are you, Pam Coast?" And it must have been at that moment that Myron Kent realized he was in a lot of hot water, because people now knew about his multiple identities. Mm-hmm. So he'd been on the run for 6 months now, and as I said, it had been national news. And one of the persons who was fascinated by the case was a young lawyer in Fargo, and his name was Melvin Hildreth, and he was an up-and-coming lawyer. He was involved in politics. He was described as being a very aggressive, abrasive person, a shouter in the courtroom. He was said to have a bullhorn voice. And he thought, if I can represent Myron Kent, I'm going to attach onto his fame and notoriety and make a name for myself. So he agrees to represent Kent, and he takes the train from Fargo and he goes out to Mandan, where Kent is now in jail. And when he gets to Mandan, he is just appalled at all the newspapers he sees. The Mandan Pioneer, week after week, being run by Tuttle, the newspaper editor, is broadcasting news about Kent, and it's all negative. So when the trial starts, the first thing Hildreth does is he says to the judge, Judge Winchester, "Everyone here is tainted. They're all prejudiced. We need a new judge. You need to recuse yourself." And Winchester did not take that very well, and he refused, and the trial began. Now, Hildreth had a couple colleagues who were helping him, and one of them, this is what he remembered later about the atmosphere for that trial in Mandan. He said, "The Lairds came and kept the very air around the courthouse charged with rumors of the many and terrible crimes Kent had committed. Detectives and newspapers were more than busy telling of Kent's guilt." And the lawyer Hildreth was also appalled by the fact that Sheriff Bingenheimer, who was one of the prosecution's witnesses, was also the one in charge of assembling the jury. And the editor, who was so against Kent, was the court reporter for the trial. But Hildreth thought the greatest outrage of all was that the Lairds had not trusted Voss, the local lawyer, the prosecuting lawyer in Mandan, to try this case. And so they went back to the mayor of Minneapolis and said, "We demand the top prosecutor in the Minneapolis office prosecute this case." And this was a man whose name was Frank Nye. And the mayor agreed. And the Lairds hired Nye, even though he had no license to practice in North Dakota. He went up to Mandan and he tried the case. Now here was the theory that Hildreth had, Kent's lawyer. His theory was that Kent had indeed embezzled $600. This is why he was asking for $600 earlier on. He worked as an insurance agent. He collected premiums, but he never paid them over to the insurance company. So he was on the run, and even after he learned his wife was dead, he did not want to come back because he was afraid he'd be arrested for embezzlement. And as for Swedinsky's confession, Hildreth said, well, he was plainly tortured. And anyway, there's testimony that he'd been drinking that day. How much stock can you put in what the farmhand Swedinsky says? But Frank Nye, the lawyer from Minneapolis, was a very experienced prosecutor, and he took over the trial. First, he tried to show that there was an insurance policy on Julia's life, and it turned out there was not. But then he argued that Kent's motives were that he'd been involved in so many crimes back in Ohio with the bank failure, he was afraid his wife was going to learn of that, and that's the reason he had her murdered. Well, the trial ended on the last day at 8:30 at night, and the jury started to deliberate. And they went past midnight, and they went to 2:30 in the morning, and the jury came in with a verdict of guilty death by hanging. So Hildreth, Kent's lawyer, appealed to the North Dakota Supreme Court, and he had a lot of grounds on which he based his appeal. His main one was he objected to the attorney Nye coming up from Minneapolis to try the case. He said, can it really be that in America, wealthy men like the Lairds can convict defendants with their own private prosecutors? Well, the North Dakota Supreme Court did not buy that argument, but plainly something troubled them about this case because they reversed it on what can only be called a technicality. They said right at the beginning, when the Judge Winchester, was asked to recuse himself, he should have done that. And the fact that he didn't means we're going to throw the verdict out. So Kent remains in jail, and the state's going to try him a second time. So while he's in jail, Kent is writing letters, and he's receiving letters as well. And the interest to me is that a lot of these letters are to these people we know in Mora. He gets a letter from J.C. Pope, who says, Kent, I cannot believe you guilty. He gets a letter from Stan Seavey. Now, Seavey's a little more nuanced about this. Here's what Seavey says in his letter. Kent, to tell you the truth, when I arrived at Mandan for the trial, I had made up my mind you were guilty. And knowing what a friend you had been to me, I could not get over it. I was put out with you and had made up my mind I would never trust another man. But as the case proceeded, I changed my mind somewhat. My advice to you is that after you get clear, give your heart to God. Quit all of your bad habits, such as card playing and drinking. And Kent had asked him, can you please get me in touch with my son Earl? And Seavey replied, Earl was poisoned against you and is beyond any power to do anything with him. Now, Kent also received a letter from his father. His father was back in Ohio, Mr. Pancoast. He was in his 80s. And one of the lawyers from Kent's father to Kent's lawyer, Hildreth, I found to be especially touching. Kent's father, in his 80s, wrote, we are in great trouble and very lonely. I am shocked and scarcely know what to do. There are so many false statements in the Medina Gazette that should be made right. My son has no right to be wronged in this way. His first wife died a natural death. A post-mortem was held. She died of gallstones in the bladder. And Will, Myron, never got over her death. And a short time after that, Mr. Pancoast died. So now the second trial is about to begin. And Hildreth goes to the new judge, Judge McConnell, and says, the trial needs to be moved. Everyone in town is prejudiced against Kent. Judge McConnell says, no, we're not going to move the trial. And they start the voir dire, the questioning of the potential witnesses, and the first 22 men, only men could be on juries then, the first 22 men, every one of them had an opinion about Kent. And so the judge changed his mind, and he said, we can't have a fair trial in this town, we're going to move it to Fargo. The trial was moved to Fargo, and it ran 3 weeks. Nye, once again, was the prosecuting attorney. Hildreth was representing Kent. It was a very acrimonious trial. You can sort of imagine the dynamics here. These parties have known each other now for a long time. They all know the case very well, and there's so much at stake. Through much of the trial, Hildreth, on his feet, was screaming at the judge. The Mandan paper was reporting this, and for a historian, this is just wonderful that the editor of the Mandan paper was the court reporter. Oftentimes what he would do, what Tuttle would do, is he would just take the transcripts he'd been typing up of what everyone said, and he just put it in the Mandan paper. So you can follow page after page of what was going on at the trial. Well, Frank Nye's star witness was none other than the boy, Earl Kent. Earl was 11 years old now. He got on the stand, and just as the farmhand had done before him, he repudiated all the testimony that he had given to the coroner's jury the night of the death. He said there'd never been any burglars. He said there was no man in the haystack. He said he'd been so excited his imagination had just run wild. He said that the next morning he walked around the house looking at the banking to see if he could see footprints, and there hadn't been any footprints. So then when Hildreth came up to cross-examine this 11-year-old, all he could really do was try to portray Myron in the best possible light. And he asked him, "Don't you love your father?" And Earl said, "I used to like to see him. He bought me a pony, and I used to ride through town when I went to school. I had a nice, comfortable little house, plenty to eat, and nice little books to read." But he said, since living in Minneapolis with Uncle Bruce, he had heard the Lairds talk a great deal about his father. They talked about the way he had forged an insurance company. Now, Hildreth made a big mistake in this trial. He was convinced, or Kent convinced him, that Kent could smooth talk the jury, and so he put Myron Kent on the stand. And that gave Nye, the prosecutor, the chance to cross-examine him. And he was able to walk through Kent's whole history, all the places he'd been, all the names he had used, what had happened with the bank back in Ohio. And when the trial was done, the jury deliberated for 7 hours, and they came back with a verdict, and once again it was guilty, and he was sentenced to death by hanging. So once again, Hildreth petitions to the North Dakota Supreme Court. And he's got a lot of grounds that he's going to argue the appeal on. And one of them is that Earl was not a relevant witness, was a coached witness. And in fact, on the stand, Earl had said, Voss, the North Dakota lawyer, and Nye have told me a good many things that I should say in my testimony against my father. He said, I do not think that I commenced to think there was anything wrong with my father until I got down to the Lairds. Earl reported the Lairds had told him they would spend a great deal of money to have his father hung. But the thing that to Hildreth was the most egregious was the use of the Black Book. This is the book that 2,000 words had been written in recounting how Julia Kent would die. The Lairds got this book right away from the sheriff right after the death, and they took it back down to Minneapolis. You know, to our 21st century sensibilities, you know, this seems outrageous that evidence would be put into the hands of the family. But this is what was done. They brought it down to Minneapolis, and they hired a Bohemian named George Rasick to interpret it for them. And Rasick read through it, and he said, Kent is not connected with this book at all. There's a scheme in this book to convict an innocent man. Now, by the time of trial, there were pages missing from the Black Notebook. Parts of Swedinsky's entries had been rubbed out. And Hildreth said, how in the world could that book be so specific in advance? For example, it had been written into the book, the gun went off and half of Julia's head was blown away. Well, how could you ever write that in advance and then have that actually happen? Well, the North Dakota Supreme Court took this appeal very seriously. They allowed the lawyers 3 days to make their arguments. But in the end, the one thing the court could not get around was Kent's reaction when he first learned that Julia was dead. Remember, Stevie had wired him, do you know your wife is dead? And he had replied, no, comply with my request to send money. The court said those are not the actions of an innocent man. They said 2 juries have heard the evidence, both came in guilty, a murder has surely been committed. The newspaper reported that upon receiving their decision that the verdict would stand, the Fargo lawyer Hildreth wept copiously. Frank Nye, the prosecutor from Minneapolis, was interviewed in the paper, and he said, this conviction illustrates the value of a good reputation. Kent's earlier life counted more strongly against him in the trial than almost any of the corroborative evidence in the prosecution. But Hildreth was a real bulldog, and he wasn't done yet. So he went and he talked to the jurors, and he found one of them who was remorseful, who said, I wish I hadn't found him guilty. I was threatened by another juror. I was bullied into doing it. And then Hildreth got in touch with a doctor in Ohio who claimed to have been attending to Kent's first wife's death. And this doctor signed an affidavit saying she had died of natural causes. And Hildreth circulated around North Dakota and Minnesota a petition. and he got 1,700 names on the petition to commute the sentence of Myron Kent. And Hildreth delivered the petition to the governor of North Dakota, whose name was Roger Allen. And the governor considered it, and he said, as an individual, I might not refuse to grant a man's life, but in an official capacity, I cannot. So all seemed lost, and the execution was only a few weeks away. And suddenly the governor receives another letter. And this is from Judge McConnell. This is the judge who presided over the second trial. And he wrote the governor, and he said, after mature deliberation and patient examination. Remember that phrase. Mature deliberation and patient examination. I found a number of reasons to doubt the verdict against Kent. One, the detailed black book could not have been written before the murder. Two, I cannot ascertain a motive by Kent to have killed his wife. Three, I'm greatly troubled by the role played in this by Walter Ehrlichman, the translator from Minneapolis, especially in obtaining this confession from the farmhand. And fourth, very troubled by all the pre-trial publicity, including all the newspaper articles. But now the hanging is just a few days away. Kent's in jail in Fargo. The St. Paul Globe reports the noise made by the workmen constructing the scaffold has had a bad effect on the other prisoners in the jail, all of whom sympathize with the condemned man, and all are of the opinion that he is innocent. Kent's lawyer Hildreth jots a note to the jailer and says, please allow Reverend Parker to see Myron Kent as often as he may request it of you. By now there are telegrams that are flooding into the governor's office. The U.S. Senator for North Dakota sends a telegram, commute the sentence. The representative in Congress does as well. Many other telegrams are coming. The Lairds are getting very nervous about all this. And Ehrlichman, the translator himself, is enraged about what the judge has said about him. So Ehrlichman writes a letter to the governor as well. And he says, I would like to know how much time Judge McConnell requires to come to a mature deliberation. And if he has made such a grave mistake in denying a new trial without a mature deliberation and patient examination, I would advise him in the future to maturely deliberate and patiently examine the evidence, even if it should take him 1.5 years to do it, as it seems it does take him that long before he finds he has committed such a grave and unpardonable error. And then he goes on, and this is maybe one of the greatest twists of the whole case. Ehrlichman says, I believe Kent is not responsible for his actions. I have looked up his record and find that he has at all times and in all places, wherever he has been, committed some crime. It seems to be a mania with him to do what is wrong. I would therefore recommend him to your leniency. Such men as Kent must be kept away from society. But a body of men has no more right to take the life of a human being than an individual has. A crime should not be punished by a crime. Kent was scheduled to be hung at dawn on November 18 in Fargo. Near midnight, the night before, the judge signed the order commuting the sentence from death by hanging to a life sentence in prison. When the news reached Mora, a businessman in Mora put a sign in his window that said, Kent still lives. Glory to God. Amen. So we're left with this question, who really was Myron Kent? For reasons that are probably obvious by now, he did not want himself to be photographed. There were only 2 known photographs of Myron Kent, and one was the photograph when he went into the penitentiary in Fargo, in Bismarck, actually. But I think a good glimpse into who Kent really was comes from an article that was in the Fargo newspaper, the Fargo Forum. The night that the governor commuted Kent's sentence, one of Kent's lawyers brought the news to Kent, and a reporter from the Fargo Forum accompanied him. And he wrote that Kent was wandering in the jail's upper hallway smoking a cob pipe. And one of the lawyers working with Hildreth leaped up the stairway 2 steps at a time to deliver the news of the governor's commutation. And the reporter was there, and Kent, upon hearing the news, said he wanted to give a statement. And the court report and the newspaper reporter took down the statement, and here's what Kent said. I am grateful to Governor Allen for his making it possible for time, the revealer of truth, to vindicate his own act in behalf of humanity, making it possible for that true lover of justice, Honorable Judge McConnell, who came forth like a bright meteor from the heavens to reflect the light of truth upon the blackness of that black book, making it possible for the thousands of our citizens and friends of American fair play and of equal justice to the weak as well as to the strong to be vindicated in their behalf, vindicated of conspiracy, fabrication, perjury, enmity, and revenge being the weapons used for mercenary motives in our courts of justice. Whenever I would feel an unrest, there has come to me a voice, as if from Julia, my darling wife, which said, patience, patience, all will yet be well. There is a God in Israel who looks after the helpless and sees to the administration of justice. And the reporter in the Fargo paper said the scene was a dramatic one, as Kent stood in the hallway leading to his cell in the flickering light, surrounded by the other prisoners who stood in open-mouthed wonder as they listened to the eloquence of their fellow prisoner. Well, there was a lot of mixed reaction to the commutation of the sentence. The lawyer, the prosecuting lawyer in Mandan, Boss, who helped Nye, he burned all bridges with Judge McConnell. He said to the newspaper, apparently the judge had an interview with Kent in the jail at Fargo, and it seems to me that there Kent, in the role of Svengali, must have hypnotized the judge. The farce enacted in the Kent case furnishes an object lesson for other states who desire to set murderers free. It seems to me that inhuman fiends who contemplate the murdering of their wives should imitate Kent and come to the state of North Dakota. So Kent was brought from the jail in Fargo to the penitentiary in Bismarck. The newspaper reported his cell is located on the opposite side of the cell room from that of Swedinsky, the self-confessed accomplice. Strangely enough, Kent can see through the heavily barred windows of the prison the little farmhouse on the farther bank of the Missouri River, about 5 miles distant, where the awful deed for which he was convicted was committed. Now, Kent had been in the newspaper so much that after this happened, there continued to be rumors. The public couldn't let this go. There are articles saying that Kent had gone blind, that Kent was dying. There was one article back in Ohio that said Governor Allen of North Dakota had appointed Kent to be his private secretary. And it's probably inevitable that there were stories saying that Swedinsky, the farmhand, had recanted his confession and proclaimed Kent to be innocent. Now, back in Mora, J.C. Pope, the lawyer, began to mail his friend Myron Kent copies of the Kanabec County Times. And Myron appreciated this. He got them in prison, and he wrote a letter back, which ended up being published in the Times. And he said he wanted to thank the kindness and humanity of heart of you good people of Mora. He continued, there is a little cottage on the banks of Lake Mora which sheltered 2 hearts that beat as one, is very dear to me and tenderly sacred as the birthplace of our darling son. A happier trio never blessed a home. Mora and her good-hearted people will ever hold a warm place in my heart. So Hildreth, the lawyer for Kent, went on to be a judge advocate in the Spanish-American War. He continued in politics. He did one of the nominating speeches for William Jennings Bryan at the 1908 Democratic Convention. Frank Nye, the prosecutor, ran for Congress and was elected, a congressman from Minneapolis. The farmhand, Tom Swedinsky, died in prison a few years later at about age 40 of natural causes. Walter Ehrlichman, the interpreter, the one who came to Mora in his disguise, stole the letters. He left Minneapolis and he went out to the West Coast, had a family, eventually became a grandfather. One of those grandsons was named John. John Ehrlichman, ended up serving in the Nixon administration and then serving in prison for the Watergate crimes. But the most tragic fate surely was that of Earl Kent, the son. When he went to testify on the stand, the Minneapolis Journal said, and I think was surely right, that his testimony would either save his father's life or send him to the gallows. Pretty heavy for an 11-year-old boy. After the trial, the Lairds brought him back to Minneapolis and they changed his name. They didn't want him to be named Kent, but they also didn't want him to be named Laird. They wanted to keep their distance from this thing. And so they named him Earl Chamberlain, which was an old family name. And he had a rough upbringing. He spent a few years in the reform school at Red Wing. When he was an adult, he moved around the country here and there. He actually came back to Kanabec County, and he lived here for a few years. He lived in a farmhouse north of Brook Park that still stands today. Then he settled out in the east. He was a traveling salesman. His reputation was of meanness. It was said of him he could never go to the same sales territory twice. He died during the Depression at 52 years of age. He had 3 children, and he was estranged from his children at the time of his death. Now, Myron Kent, who had been entered into the pen in 1896, 16 years later, in 1912, he's working in the prison as a bookkeeper for the prison store, and he has a heart attack and he dies immediately. He was 67 years old at the time. He'd been in prison, as I said, 18 years. It had been about 30 years since he had founded Mora. When news came back to Mora, his old friend Charles Williams, C.E. Williams, rode out to the undertaker at the prison. And the undertaker said, normally when a prisoner dies, we take the body and we give it to the medical school. But we didn't do that with Myron Kent. There was a funeral for him and there were a lot of flowers. He said, I have only seen one man who says he believes Mr. Kent was a guilty man. He says Mr. Kent refused just last year to sign an application for a pardon, saying that if he signed it, it would be a confession of his guilt, and he was not guilty. That was in 1912, so 40 years go by, and in 1952, the Kanabec County Times does a story, because it's been 40 years, and they recount a bit about the Kent saga. And in that article in 1952, the writer says, if old-timers who remember got together, many of them would still dispute the Kent case. So, how in the world did I learn all this? Well, computers are helpful. I was a history major in college. Learned some research skills. But I'm going to go all the way back to when I was living in Mora as a boy. And I can remember some friends telling me that there were Indian mounds down by Fish Lake, and I was interested in that. And I went to the library in Mora. At that time, it was down in the basement of the fire hall. I don't know if anyone remembers Roy Wolgeson. He was at the library, and I went in as a 13-year-old boy, 12-year-old boy, and I'm asking whether there's anything I can get about the history of the area. And so that's how I first learned about a person named Myron Kent. And I also remember going to the Times office as a boy, asking if they would let me read some of the old newspapers, and they were more than happy to let me do that. And I can remember coming, as I said, to the History Center here, but I came 7-8 years ago when I was researching this story for the Minnesota Historical Society. And it was through looking through the records here that I discovered that Myron Kent had a great-granddaughter whose name was Julia. She had been named after the murdered Julia so many years ago. And she lives out in upstate New York. And I got in correspondence with her. This is how I was able to find out what happened to Earl in his later years. And in fact, she and her husband, who had never been to Mora, were very interested in seeing this town that her great-grandfather had founded. And so a few years ago, on a summer afternoon, I had lunch at Freddy's with Julia Chamberlain and her husband, and she showed me her ring, her wedding ring, which was the same ring that Julie had worn for her wedding and had died in, and the Lairds had kept it. It stayed in the family, and now she had it. So the Kanabec History Center is a great resource. I mean, it really adds to the depth of living in a place like Kanabec County. My hope would be that the patrons support the History Center, that the county board supports the History Center. You know, the Myron Kent story, as interesting as it is just one story. There are a lot of stories out there. I think Mora is unique. And once a place has lost its history, it loses that unique sense. It's just like any other place. So, thank you.
I was not scheduled to make any remarks, but I just can't let go of this one. Paul Kilgor, was he guilty?
I knew I was going to be asked that, and I made myself a promise. I'm going to let you decide. I'm not going to tell you.
Okay. Somebody help me out.
You now know as much as I know.
On the evidence is presented, should this august group take a vote? Would anybody be offended? I've testified in court a number of times as an expert. I'm a professional engineer, and this has been my business for the past 30-some years. And I was so fascinated by Paul's portrayal of the evidence and the revealing of the evidence, and how I would say separated from it he was. There he is, and he still is. But shall we take a vote?
Do it.
Do it.
And we'll take a vote with no opinion. Somebody help me do the counting. I'm going to do this.
I'll count.
Marcy, McVeigh, Tuchin. Okay, those who do not have an opinion as yet, raise their hands. Would you count them? 13. Would you? Would someone write that down? Would somebody write that number down, please? 13 with no.
I'll remember it. 13.
Okay. Marcy. Those who think he is not guilty. Not guilty.
2. Unless I missed some. Okay.
Well, then let's get an exact count. Those who think he is guilty.
Well, 13, I think.
13 is not guilty.
Is not guilty.
13 have no opinion.
I might have missed it.
How many think he's guilty?
13.
We've asked that.
Yes.
Okay, so then the rest of you then think that he is.
It's tied between guilty and no opinion.
So that leaves how many people?
2 that had no, 2 that said that he was not guilty. 2 not guilty. 13 guilty.
She had no opinion, and then she said, no, if you want that,
Marcy,
But you really, do we need to get this minute?
no.
The exact count?
Yeah, no, let's just, the count you have so far is?
2 say that he is not guilty, 13 say he is guilty, and 13 have no opinion.
Those are the numbers in form. Kevin.
Well, what's your opinion about the court proceedings, interviewing of the witnesses? You know, what is your thought process with your past experience as an expert witness? How